Welcome back. Now that you have a starter that you are ready to start baking with, let's talk about how to maintain your starter. You can either keep your starter on the counter outside of the fridge, or you can store it inside the refrigerator. If you want to keep your starter very active, then storing it on the counter like this one is probably the best situation. This is because you need to feed the starter every day if it lives outside of the fridge. The constant feeding causes the starter to be bubbly and ready to leaven a loaf of bread. It is completely okay to keep your starter in the fridge. If you do not want to feed your starter every day, I would suggest that. That can get to be a lot to deal with every day. And I almost would recommend keeping it in the fridge while you're learning what your baking schedule is going to look like. When you put your starter in the fridge, the fermentation process slows way down. This means it takes a much longer time for the starter to grow than it would have if it was outside on the counter. This also means that you have to feed it much less frequently. I would suggest feeding it every week, maybe even up to 10 or 12 days, depending on the strength of your starter. That being said, sourdough starters are tough creatures. They can withstand a lot. So if you forget about your starter for a long time, just bring her out of the fridge and give it a couple feedings, and eventually she will become active again. Whatever you do, don't throw her out, because most likely it's still alive and just needs some TLC to become bubbly once more. Let's jump into doing our sourdough starter maintenance feeding. I am using a 1-2-2 feeding, meaning for the one part of starter that I have, I will feed her 2 times that amount in flour and water. So for example, I am keeping 50 grams of starter. That means I am going to feed her 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. This is the system that works for me to know that she will be perfectly ready for baking tomorrow morning. If I fed her a 1-1-1 ratio, meaning 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of flour, and 50 grams of water, she would peak too early and fall too much by the morning. This would be useful, however, if I needed to bake on a different schedule and needed her to be ready more quickly. You can change what flour you are using or combine different flours, but it must equal the same amount. Meaning, in my previous example of 1-2-2, if I wanted to add 50 grams of bread flour, instead of just using all-purpose flour, you can do that and just decrease the regular flour to 50 grams. Then you would have a total of 100 grams of flour. So your 1-2-2 ratio would still be intact. Adding bread flour gives your starter more protein so it can strengthen the starter. But it is not necessary to do, and you can definitely just use unbleached all-purpose flour like I do. If you feel that your jar is starting to get crusty, simply transfer your starter to a new jar. This should not hurt your starter or even affect your starter really. Now I'm going to place 50 grams of starter in my new jar. For reference, you don't need to keep so much starter or so little starter. It really just depends on what you need for your baking schedule. I also know generally what 50 grams or 100 grams of starter looks like in my jars. So a lot of the time, I do not even measure the weight of the starter. I just guess how much it is and do my feeding off of that. I wouldn't suggest doing that until your starter is mature and you are really confident about how much a certain amount looks like in your jar. For now, let's place 50 grams of starter in the new jar and add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of room temperature water. Now, I usually keep my starter in that big jar like you just saw. However, I'm using all my big jars because I'm collecting a lot of discard because I have a very big video coming on discard recipes, so I need as much as I possibly can have. So this is going to get a little bit tight in this jar. However, the starter is going to be just fine. Genevieve can endure anything I really do to it. When you mix your starter, make sure to dissolve all of the flour clumps into the starter. Cover with your cloth or a non-airtight lid and let your starter begin to ferment. It should be ready in about 5 to 12 hours, depending greatly on the environment that you are in. Remember that the warmer your environment is, the more likely that your starter will rise quickly, versus a slower rise in a colder environment. The rest of the unused starter becomes discard. I have a discard jar which I keep in the fridge, and I simply add what is left to that jar. There are a million recipes you can make with sourdough discard. My favorite of which is this brownie recipe. I will link in the description as well. The sourdough flavor that comes from discard elevates any recipe to a delicacy, in my opinion. If I wanted to use this starter in dough sooner than what I originally thought, I would simply perform the float test to see if the starter was strong and vigorous enough to leaven a loaf of bread. If you watched my Everything You Need to Know About Sourdough Starter video, I'll link it right here, you will know that the float test is taking a small portion of your starter and placing it in water to see if it floats. If it floats, it is ready to make dough. If it sinks, it either needs more time to grow or you waited too long and the CO2 gases are released, resulting in a falling starter. After using a large portion of this starter in a bread recipe, I will have a small amount of starter left, so there will be very little to discard in the next feeding. Now that your starter is fed, the only thing there is to do is wait. However, if you were just doing a normal feeding for a starter that lives in the fridge, wait an hour after feeding it to let it become active, and then simply put it back in the fridge. Similarly, when you take the starter out of the fridge to feed it to begin with, wait an hour before feeding it to let it come to room temperature. I do one feeding outside of the fridge before using my starter in dough. However, it may be a good idea to do a couple feedings outside of the fridge to make her more active and therefore more strength for your dough. I also play it by ear, so I know if in the coming week or 2 weeks I'm not going to bake at all, I'm out of town or just really busy, then I will put my starter in the fridge so that she's just much less maintenance in those coming weeks. However, I also know that if I randomly decide that I do want to bake on a day I thought I wasn't going to, it's okay. I can just take her out, let her come to room temperature, do a feeding, and she will give me a good loaf of bread. So while I do usually have Genevieve out on the counter, there are times where I put her in the fridge and she does just fine. So really, it's about finding what works for you. Just remember that through all of this, what matters is to feed your starter flour and water, and everything else will fall into place. Starters are resilient. Give yourself grace if you make a mistake with it, because we've all been there. Leave any questions that you may have and watch this video for all the information you need to know about sourdough starter. Thank you so much.